Hi class and welcome back to another lecture for Intro to Psych. Today we're going to go over one of the most information-dense chapters, Chapter 2, Biology of the Brain. So when we're looking at what's going to be kind of the focus of this chapter, we are going to focus on how a neuron works from start to finish, so understanding the parts of a neuron, how they work. We're also going to talk about the chemical versus electrical signals that go on in the brain, so how a neuron is using electrical signals to send out a chemical signal. Then we're going to move on to the parts of the nervous system, so not just a neuron specifically, but looking at how neurons make the nervous system. Then finally, the biggest, most advanced part of the nervous system that we should talk about, the brain. So without further ado, let's jump right in. To start, we'll use this pretty philosophical question, right? Are the mind and the brain the same thing? This is something you can think about. There's no right or wrong answer, but you might think the mind and the brain are the same thing. You might think that the mind and the brain are totally different, or you might be of the mind, or you might think that you need maybe your brain to have a mind. So, thinking about this is an interesting way because your philosophical perspective sets up a lot of your beliefs about the brain. One thing I always like to tell people is our brain is so super advanced that we've never been able to fully recreate it. We been able to recreate? This guy, a zebrafish. We have been able to track the neurons of a zebrafish, every single neuron, and see what it does and kind of understanding that. But to scale that up to human level complexity, that's something really difficult that we can't do. So, how we're going to work on this again is by starting with the building blocks of the nervous system, talking about neurons, moving to the peripheral nervous system, how we move and our body is able to function. And then we'll talk about the central nervous system, how our brain works. So, what is the nervous system? Well, it's really just an information superhighway, if nothing else. It is not something that makes you nervous necessarily, but what the nervous system does is it transmits signals to and from the brain. Uh, so this works as a network of cells that carries info to the brain and to all parts of your body. So this is what gives you access to the outside world. Your brain is locked inside the skull. It can't get out. It doesn't have the ability to see. It has to use the eyes, right? Things like that. So to break a nervous system down, it's very basic, right? What does a nervous system do? Well, it takes info in. Then it does something with that info. We're not going to get into that part today. But then after it does something with that info, it generates a response. And how you can think about this is that we have a sensation. You see a bright light, and that bright light kind of gets combined with information I wonder why there's a bright light going on. Oh, I think it must be morning. Maybe my light's turned on. Something of that sort. And then you have some kind of output response. You might kind of squint your eyes more or, roll over in bed if this is the case. So, right, the idea of receiving input, having that input travel via your senses, as we'll talk about in the next chapter. Have those senses reach the brain, and that brain is going to use that information in some way and then send that response down to the nerves. So you touch a hot stove, that's going to send a signal from your pain receptors all the way up your body to your brain that says owie. And then that is going to send a signal for you to move your hand. So we are going to receive an input, do something with it, tell us to move our hand, and then move our hand in this case. Now, you'll notice that in our brain, we have two major types of cells, and I've talked about neurons. There's also these cells called glial cells. Glial cells, for the purposes of this class, we're going to think about these as more of the janitor cells. They're going to help the neurons, our major type of cells or signaling cells, grow. So for this class, what we're going to focus on are neurons, these very specialized cells that allow us to send messages. Again, all of our nervous system is passing on a message. There's a great video kind of going over this whole process in the PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to show this, but if you want to, go ahead and watch this, I think, as a good kind of reference for this. But when it comes to neurons, There's a lot of different types of neurons. There are sensory neurons. So the sensory neurons in our eyes, what we'll talk about, that help us see color and see light. There are sensory neurons in our fingers, in our toes, and under our skin for temperature, for sensation, for how much something is pressure on our skin. There's also motor neurons that connect to our muscles, right, that tell us to move. But the neurons we're going to focus on are going to be what we call relay neurons. So, not the neurons at the start of the process or the end of the process, not the one that gets the light signal from the eye, and not the one that tells the muscle to, contract. We're going to focus on the ones in between. So, the ones that relay or pass on that idea, so that connect these neurons together. So, in this example here, you can see this neuron is actually connecting to another neuron, just passing on the signal. So relay neurons are what we're going to focus on here. But how do these neurons communicate with each other? Well, what neurons are going to do is neurons are going to use an electrical signal along, right, which is going to send kind of information along this axon, along this long portion, down to these dendrites, or excuse me, down to these terminal buttons, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But then when those terminal buttons send out their messengers, those messengers that they're going to send out are actually chemicals. And those chemicals are going to start this process in the next neuron. And so to take this from kind of a more spread out view of neurons, let's zoom in here. So again, you see this electrical signal being sent from these sections of the neuron, but at the in-between portion, right between these two neurons, which we're going to kind of make larger here, you are going to see this terminal button, this axon button, whatever you want to call it, axon terminal. And you will see right over here the next neuron. And what's going to happen is we are going to send an electrical pulse, which will help send these chemical messengers, these neurotransmitters, packaged up here, into this what we call synaptic cleft, or this little gap. And the hope is that if we send enough of these little transmitters out, they're going to lock on to these keys on this other neuron's dendrite. So the idea is to kind of, it's similar to smoke signals. We are going to send out our smoke signal here and hope that the next neuron receives that smoke signal to then pass it on. Or, right, you could imagine this similar to lifeguards on the beach, that the lifeguard is going to stand up and, make a noise so that the next person knows that they have to do something. So how does this work? Well, here's an example of a neuron, and I want to kind of go over the features of a neuron. So in here, right, you can see that we have what we call the soma, or the cell body. So this is going to be the body or the central component of the neuron. This neuron is also going to have what are known as dendrites. So dendrites are, it's actually the Greek word for hair, dendra. So this is going to be like kind of I have a good example of this. Hairy portion, not really, but this is going to be the portion of the neuron that is trying to receive signals. So in the same way that roots go under the ground and spread out in order to collect nutrients, these dendrites are going to spread out, and you can actually see the next neuron's dendrites here spreading out so that they can receive connections from other neurons. So these dendrites over here and over here are going to be another component, but once enough of these signals have been sent to these dendrites, sent to the soma here, that signal gets sent down the axon, this long kind of tubular portion of the neuron, and it may or may not be coated by a myelin sheath, a sheath of fatty, kind of a fatty material, which helps neurons to fire and move faster. All of this works in order to send this firing signal, this electrical signal, down to our axon terminals, our axon buttons, which are filled with these vesicles. Vesicles you want to think about as kind of these big circular packaged almost transporters that have thousands of neurotransmitters in them. And those neurotransmitters are going to be able to be pushed out of the axon terminal into that next dendrite and kind of continuing this process, propagating it down. So, what seems like a silly question, but might help you here. Right? So, Kenny is a quarterback on the football team, and his job is to throw the ball into the air to the wide receiver. And the wide receiver is going to catch that ball and score a touchdown. So, in a neuron, which part plays the role of the wide receiver, the one catching the football? Well, the answer here is going to be D, dendrites. Why is it a dendrite? Well, that is the part that is catching the electrical signals from the previous neuron. So you can imagine that Kenny here, the quarterback, is going to be throwing those vesicles, those kind of portions filled with neurotransmitters, to the next dendrite. Okay, so what I've said so far is that we send out a chemical signal to tell the next neuron to fire. But how does the next neuron know to fire? Well, it uses what's known as an action potential. So in our brains are going to be filled with a lot of different fluids, cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid is going to be a mix of calcium, chlorine, and potassium. Our brain is going to be filled with potassium. However, the fluid is also going to be filled with sodium. So what is going to happen is that when enough of these channels in these dendrites open up, they're going to send in a chemical signal, which is going to operate on this kind of all or nothing basis. I use a picture of a gun here because a neuron works in the same way as firing a gun, where you can put more and more pressure on the trigger. You can increase the amount of or the change in the polarization. You can make the neuron in your brain a little bit less negatively charged. And once it hits that level of negative charge, it's like pulling enough of the trigger on the gun that the gun is going to fire. And once the gun fires, you can't unfire the gun. So if a bunch of dendrites on a neuron are receiving signals that say, hey, open up, hey, fire your next, fire a signal, they might reach this threshold that says, okay, this is like pulling the trigger. I have pulled it enough, and now we have depolarized. We have made this neuron now no longer negatively charged, but slightly positively charged. And so after that happens, we need to reset it, bring it back down, and make it all negatively charged again. So how does this work? Well, what is happening is we have channels in our neurons on our axon, which are selectively permeable. They are allowing some chemicals to come in and some chemicals to go out. And so you'll notice that in our neurons, we have a negative charge. So we are polarized. We are negatively polarized in our brains, each of our neurons. Outside of that neuron, in that cerebrospinal fluid, it's positively charged. So there's this difference here. And so what happens when our neurons start saying, hey, let in some more information? Well, all of a sudden, these neurons, these dendrites are going to be getting some more information, which is going to reach that soma, that cell body. That cell body is going to receive so much positive kind of ions that it is going to say, it's time to fire. I have reached that pulling of the trigger. What happens here is then we see a flood. All of a sudden, all of the positive ions from outside fill in here and send this information, send this down the way. So it's similar to doing the wave as a group of people. The next person's going to do the wave, and it's going to pass on this signal down until it reaches these axon terminals. When it reaches those axon terminals, it is going to send those out with those neurotransmitters, those vesicles filled with neurotransmitters, to the next neuron. But don't neurons get tired, right? They can't fire always because we've made this from a negative charge to a positive charge. But we have to reset it. So how do we reset that? Well, we use ion pumps, which pump out all of those positive ions and bring those negative ions back in. This is what we call a refractory period. There's a short period of time where we need to repolarize, where our neurons need to kind of reset themselves. A short little GIF of how this works, right, is and you can kind of see this here, is you can see this propagation of a neuron firing. So enough dendrites have said to fire that in the axon hillock, we've kind of hit the go portion, ready to go. What are we going to do? We are going to send that signal down the way in order to pass on those neurotransmitters. Now, like we mentioned, though, and as I want to bring up again, we can talk about this myelin sheath, which is going to be insulating the axon. This is specifically going to be used for like motor neurons. So when we want to get a signal to travel faster, right? If I put my hand on a hot stove, I need that signal to very fast tell my hand to move. This is going to have myelination on it. So these certain cells are going to be faster sending information if they have more of this myelin sheath around them. Okay, so let's do a quick summary here. So our dendrites are going to get some kind of input from our previous neuron, right? And that information is going to get put to the cell body. It's going to say, hey, we are ready to fire. When enough of those positive ions get in here and say we're ready to fire, the action potential occurs. That action potential, the firing of the gun, goes off and it sends that wave of positive ions down the axon all the way to the buttons to the terminal. At that axon terminal here, right? So then we look at the zoomed in area here. We can see that these neurotransmitters packaged in these vesicles are going to be pushed out into this synaptic cleft where they are hopefully going to connect to the next neuron, the next dendrite, and do the exact same cycle again, right? Now this dendrite gets input. Hopefully it leads to enough input to fire another neuron. So, right, the last thing to mention is that those neurotransmitters are at that axon. They are being pushed out through here. So, moving on, you can imagine here we've got two neurons, Mary and Ralph. Mary is now experiencing an influx of positive ions and she's depolarizing. What is going to happen to Mary? Is she going, right, is this what we call hyperpolarization? Is she just going to do nothing? Is she going to have an action potential? Or is she going to have an inhibitory potential? Well, when the positive ions are coming in, that is going to hopefully cause an action potential, right, causing this to fire. Now, on the other hand, imagine that this neuron just fired an action potential and it can't fire again. What is that called? Is that a postsynaptic potential, myelin polarization, or a refractory period? It is a refractory period. So again, just another short video, or excuse me, a short kind of picture to show you how these action potentials flow. These are for motor neurons, but just like anything else, this kind of works. You'll notice there's a lot more information that I'm not necessarily worried about, but how the dendrites are going to receive this connection. It's going to kind of be integrated. It's going to get pushed into that soma, this body of the cell. It's going to fire when we have that action potential. And that action potential is going to go down to these buttons. So to hopefully watch a short video of this, you can see here, as I'm going to talk over this, these neurons right here are going to be firing. So here is a neuron kind of getting that pulse. There is it firing off. You can see how these positive ions outside are being pushed in and sending this down the way. So here are these positive ions coming in with those negative ions inside the neuron being pushed out. So, right, again, this kind of big process we can see at the terminal buttons, all of these vesicles, these small little kind of rounded cells full of neurotransmitters, putting these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, which are hopefully opening the next neurotransmitter. And this is going to propagate the next cycle. So again, this is the way of, hey, we are now sending our smoke signal to the next neuron, which hopefully sees that smoke signal and says, hey, I have to fire as well. So, we have spent a lot of time talking about this electrical connection from the start of a dendrite of one neuron through the soma, through the axon buttons, and out. But now let's kind of be very specific about this chemical signal, right? So, when these neurotransmitters that start the chemical signal react, well, how are they really getting into the neuron? Or, excuse me, into the synapse? Well, they're just kind of being pushed out. This is a picture of an electron from an electron microscope of a vesicle, a terminal button, which has a bunch of vesicles in it. So the vesicles are the blue and orange kind of things in here, and you can see this is 100 micrometers in size, a very small size. So each of these blue or orange dots has about 10,000 neurotransmitters in it. So there's a lot of these that get pushed out into this. And what happens when these get pushed out? Well, it's kind of like what would happen if you pushed out, blew up a balloon full of glitter. It would explode everywhere. So I almost like to think about the axon terminal at the bottom of your neuron here, at the bottom of one neuron, is kind of similar to an airplane, an airport, someplace you might go to catch an airplane. Right? In the way that neurotransmitters at the axon terminal are packaged into vesicles. Just in the same way that you as a passenger are packaged into airplanes, which are then sent off to the next neuron, or in this case, airport. The issue, though, is that, right, where this metaphor falls apart is the fact that you're not being packaged gently to your next destination. In reality, it's more of a dumping, right? So as soon as you are put into that synaptic cleft, that vesicle is going to pop and it's going to hopefully get there, but right, this is not the best pilot. There's a lot of great information in the book that goes into a lot of detail. I want you to know overall, and you'll see in the study guide the level of info you need to know. But again, seeing how these neurotransmitters are connecting to the next dendrite in order to open them up and pass on the next signal. So if you've stuck with me so far, in sum, these electrical signals are used within the neuron, right? So these four portions, but this small gap between neurons, between an axon terminal and a dendrite of the next neuron, is going to be the chemical signal. And the chemical signal is what kickstarts the electrical process. You can't have one without the other. So neurons are slightly negatively charged. They are at some point going to receive an input from a neurotransmitter on their dendrites. Now, that original one is going to be from your senses, right? So what you feel. But we're talking again about the relays. So you're just this is a neuron in the middle of the road from trying to get a signal from maybe your eyes to your brain. So this neuron is going to get a signal from a previous neuron that says, hey, send a signal that says, yes, fire. How's that going to work? Well, that's going to put all that information into this synaptic cleft. If enough of these receptors open up, these neurotransmitters hit their mark and they open up, then we are going to fire another neuron, right? This is going to lead to more electricity in this neuron number 2. So at a certain point, enough of that energy is going to collect up here. It's going to collect in here and say, okay, it's time to fire the next neuron. That action potential occurs. And so that action potential is going to send that wave of electricity down. That wave of electricity is going to cause these vesicles here, these guys, to pop out, explode into the synaptic cleft, and hopefully connect to the next one. It's a lot like throwing sand into the ocean, right? And hoping that it's going to hit its mark. Right? You're just releasing it and hoping that it makes this. So if you've survived this far in the lecture, take a break. You've earned it. But this is going to be a key component in understanding how neurons, right? This is the building blocks of our brain, of our nervous system, is sending this signal over and over again that says, right, the first signal says, hey, this is an ouchie. This signal is going to say, hey, I felt that ouchie too. Send to the brain that there's an ouchie. Send information that there's an ouchie to this next neuron. That next neuron gets that information, says, hey, the past neurons felt an ouchie. I want to send that signal forward, if we're talking about pain in this case. So a question for you. Ralph is a neuron in a resting state, so there are more negative ions inside of him than outside. So how would we describe him? We would describe him as polarized, because there is a charge. He is negatively charged. He's closer to the negative pole than he would be not right depolarized. So we've spent a lot of time with this this electrical signal, but let's talk about neurotransmitters as these chemical signals. So what's really interesting is that these chemical signals work on different circuits. So there are a lot of different types of neurotransmitters, and you might want to think about them as different types of keys. Every key you have doesn't fit every lock, otherwise it would be a bad key and a bad lock. But each of these neurotransmitter signals operates on one of two possible choices: stop or go. So when you're sending information to the next neuron, you're sending information that says, hey, fire, or it says, hey, don't fire. So excitatory neurotransmitters are neurotransmitters which excite the next neuron. It says, hey, go, do something, yay. Inhibitory neurotransmitters are going to tell the next neuron to inhibit itself, not to fire. You might wonder, why might we not want our neurons to fire? Well, what happens if you want to hold still? You want your neurons to not be moving on accident, right? You want your body to hold still. So there are good reasons to want to inhibit certain feelings as well, and certain sensations. So like I mentioned, there are different types of neurotransmitters that say stop or go, but not all of them are going to fit onto the same signals. You can't use the same key for every lock. So you kind of see a version of that here. And what I'd like to note is that for the interest of this video series, the neurotransmitters that I'm most interested in talking about are the dopamine neurotransmitters. So this is going to be related to learning, mood, and sleep. Anything that is rewarding to us gives us dopamine. So that could be watching TV makes us happy. So we'd get that. Doing drugs gives us dopamine. If my daughter smiles at me, that gives me dopamine. And that gives me pleasure. So you might think about the dopamine set of circuits as our pleasure centers, which helps us to learn. The norepinephrine circuits are going to be the adrenaline circuits. Norepinephrine is our body's natural adrenaline, right? And so this is going to be something very useful as we move on to the fight or flight portion of the body, right? So it's good for our body to use that norepinephrine as an excitatory neurotransmitter. It says, hey, something bad is going to happen. Get your body ready to go. And finally, serotonin, the happiness chemical, one that's more related to mood. So with serotonin, right, individuals who have depression are often treated by giving them kind of increasing the amount of serotonin in their brain. And that actually really pairs well with what we're about to talk with next, is some question you may have asked yourself related to, well, what happens to those neurotransmitters that just sit out here? They've got to do something eventually, right? They don't just sit out here. We don't just put garbage out all day. Somebody's got to come clean it up. Yeah. And so what happens is that our bodies are recycling neurotransmitters. So after a while of these neurotransmitters sitting in this synaptic cleft, they've either bound to some kind of receptor that says, hey, we can accept this receptor. You've put your key in the lock. They might just, on the other hand, get reuptaken. There are portions on the axon terminal that can take those neurotransmitters back so we can use them again later, recycling them. or some of our some of our neurotransmitters will just degrade. That's where the glial cells come in, helping us to clean up afterwards. You can also note that part of the reason we sleep, we'll talk about this later, is because we need to kind of reset our neurotransmitter sensitivities throughout the day. But as I mentioned, what about serotonin here? How do we add happiness chemical? How do we add serotonin to a person's brain in order to make them not as depressed? Well, one class of drugs that we use are called SSRIs, which stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Let's break that down because it helps to explain this. Selective serotonin, we are going to look for the serotonin neurotransmitter here. And what we are going to do is look for the reuptake transporters, the ones that bring in the serotonin. And we are going to stop them. So what we're doing here is we're putting serotonin into our neurotransmitter synaptic cleft, our synaptic cleft, all these neurotransmitters are in here, but they're staying in there longer because we're blocking up the reuptakes. So there's a better chance for this information to these neurotransmitters to be put onto these receptors, to bind to the next neurotransmitter and say, hey, the next neuron and say, hey, this is the happy feeling here. So hopefully that helps you to understand how these chemical signals kickstart the electrical process for the next neuron. So let's move on to now looking at the nervous system as a whole. If you think about what we just did, we have talked about the individual building blocks. So the equivalent of each brick that we need to build our house. So the neurons are our bricks, and now we are going to figure out how we can kind of design this information superhighway to best benefit us. What you'll notice right off the bat is that we're dividing this into two, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time focused on the central nervous system, the brain, but we also want to talk about how our peripheral nervous system works. A lot of this is going to be, as you'll see, an automatic system for us. But the peripheral nervous system is going to be the set of neurons and set of nerves, right, that keeps us in touch with the world. They are on the peripheral, the outside. So this is going to be the stuff that is not the brain and the spinal cord, but the nerves that get sent to the rest of your body, right? You think about your funny bone. If you've ever hit your funny bone, it's not a bone, it's a nerve. You're hitting a set of neurons there that is sending a signal that says, this makes me feel weird, to the rest of your body, well, your brain. So the peripheral nervous system is going to do two things. It is going to say, hey, I felt something. I sensed something. I felt a touch, or, my eyes, saw something, or I heard something. And then it's also, it's going to send that information to the brain. The brain's going to do something with it. That's step 2. And step 3 is going to be how the body reacts. So doing that motor function. So turning your head when you hear something. So let's talk about breaking the peripheral nervous system into two parts, the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic nervous system under the peripheral nervous system is going to be related to the body, soma. So soma, right, the cell body, right, the same thing here. This is going to be somatic, about your body. So this is carrying information to and from, right, our skeletal muscles. So this has a sensory pathway, how we sense things. So, right, I poke you on the hand or on the shoulder, right, and your nerves feel that, and it sends information. It's the afferent way to the brain. I like to think about afferent as arriving at the brain, afferent arriving. On the other hand, there is the motor pathway. The motor pathway is going to be the output. So, right, I touch you on the shoulder, That's when, right, the motor pathway are going to be the efferent nerves exiting the brain, and those are going to be the nerves that are turning your body, making your skeleton move here. You can see how these actually run in very similar but not the same pathways through the spinal cord, right? So if you stepped on a Lego, for instance, the sensory neurons are going to be more in the back of your spine, whereas the motor neurons, kind of sending the signal for what to do, are going to be in the front of your spine. So moving on from there, we can talk about one of the most important things in this chapter, in my opinion, something that we've all heard of, our autonomic nervous system. Now, you've probably not heard of it with that term, but you know about your fight or flight responses. And so your autonomic nervous system is going to be the automatic, you almost want to think about it. It's going to be bodily functions outside of our control. So I can't necessarily control how much, right, my blood pressure, what my blood pressure is, unless I get angry or something. I can't sit here and try really hard to make my body digest any faster. I can't work on my liver, right? I can't think really hard and make my liver work better or worse. These are all things that are completely automatic and outside of our control for the most part, right? Yeah, sure. I can probably make my heart rate go up if I start trying to breathe really heavy for a while. But for the most part, if I see something scary or if I'm running, I don't have to consciously think, oh, I need to breathe more. My body does these things automatically. And we split this system into two, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. So we've got the sympa and the parasympa. So you want to think about para as next to here. And these two represent your fight or flight responses. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. This is going to make your body get ready to go. So imagine that you are waking up in the middle of the night and maybe you look in the corner of your room and you see that pile of clothes on the chair and you think it's a person. And in that moment, your body is going to say, oh my goodness, send some adrenaline. We got to get ready to do something. And I don't know if that's going to be get ready to jump up and fight this person or if that's going to be to run as fast as I can. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be the one that is activating itself. I like to think about it that, as we'll say, the sympathetic is keeping us safe. Compare that to the parasympathetic nervous system. This is what I also like to think of as rest and digest. So think about, hopefully now, when you're watching this video, relaxing, hopefully. You are resting. Your body is not freaking out. You're not getting ready to mobilize yourself to run away or to get into a fight. And so, after you have ran away, or maybe after you have eaten lunch and now you're kind of just relaxing, that is your parasympathetic nervous system activated. So the sympathetic nervous system is activated under stress, while the parasympathetic nervous system is activated when things are peaceful. Sympathetic stress, parasympathetic peaceful. Hopefully that helps you remember. So the way that you can think about the sympathetic nervous system is through the 5 Fs. We can, right, when we are confronted with something and our sympathetic nervous system is activated, we can choose to fight. We can choose flight or to flee from something. We might freeze, which is something that very common happens to individuals. We also might fawn. This is a response where we move towards the scary figure, maybe because they'll be nice to us. And finally, the 5th F is mating. Parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, you want to think about more as rest and digest, right? So 5 Fs versus rest and digest. Again, looking at how this sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, they're going to be activating the same things, but one is going to say, hey, hurry up, we need to do something, and the other is going to say, don't worry, deal with your normal everyday functions, we're not in a big scary place. What's interesting to note is that, as we sometimes forget, we're all animals too. Human beings are animals. And just like other animals, we have a nervous system that tells us when there's danger. But we live in a very different world than a lot of animals. What is our danger? Our danger isn't necessarily a lion coming to get us, but our danger is an exam. And it turns out that we interpret stress the same way, regardless of whether it is being chased by a bear or being worried about what our boyfriend or girlfriend thinks about us. That this can just cause us that same level of issue in our body. So, this is going to that point that says that stress is bad for your health, and this is why. So, a question you might see on an exam, right? When walking in the woods, Amy sees a bear. And so when she sees this bear, she's afraid. The sympathetic branch of her autonomic nervous system is activated. What is most likely to happen when this sympathetic branch is activated? The answer is B, right? She is going to begin a fight or flight response here. Similarly, another question, imagine you're standing outside outside in line for a movie, and you hear some music coming from the radio. You really like the song, and so you start to dance. What part of your nervous system allows you to move around and dance? That is going to be your somatic body part of your nervous system. Wonderful. So again, if you've made it to this point, congratulations. This is checkpoint 2 for this lecture. Take a good break. Go stare at the sun for well, not directly. Go outside and look at some trees and relax and touch some grass, and then come back so we can finish up on the central nervous system. Alrighty, assuming that you've touched grass or at least thought about it, we are moving on to this other side of this chart here, the central nervous system. And to start, we'll start with a very short part, the spinal cord. What's the spinal cord? It's just a really fast highway. It helps us get information from our feet to our brain, lickety-split. This uses those sensory and motor neurons to send and receive signals. Now, something I haven't mentioned here is that certain reflexes that we have don't even need to be activated in our brains for us to fire them. We have what's known as a reflex arc in our spinal cord. So certain things like having air blown in your eyes causes you to blink reflexively. That is something that your brain doesn't even need to perceive, actually. This happens so fast. But the vast majority of things, right, the things that aren't our reflexes are going to be sent up through up through our spinal cord into our brain. Our brain is going to do something with this information, send that information back down, and have an output. And that's the spinal cord. Now we get into the big one, the brain. So let's talk about the brain. So some fun facts about the brain are the brain is a really light thing when we dry it out. It's only 3 ounces dry. It's like a sponge. However, if we were to take it out of your head, you die, but it also would weigh about 3 pounds while wet. Now, what's interesting is 80% of the human brain is this outer layer that is very, for lack of a better term, wrinkly. Sure, we've heard that term lately. And 80% of that of our brain are those wrinkles. Funnily enough, those are absent in things like fish and reptiles and birds. Those are smooth-brained animals. Now, what's also interesting is we don't have nearly the biggest brains. Right? You can think about the fact that dolphins have a very interesting brain structure too. Their cerebellum, as we'll talk about here, is much bigger than the human cerebellum because they're swimming. They have to understand things in 3 dimensions. We just walk on the ground. Only 1/3 of our cortex is visible from the outer portion of our brain. And if we were to spread it out, it would be the size of a sheet of newspaper, about 4 pages of a textbook. And the brain, as far as we know, is the most advanced organ that has ever been created. It's also the only thing that's ever named itself. It is the most complex part of the nervous system. It allows us to do complex information processing. It allows us to do things more than just feel a reflex and immediately respond. So, we are going to talk about the brain in three different parts: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And so, the way that this is going to be structured is from the oldest portion of the brain to the newest portion of the brain. So, let's look at this here. So, we have the hindbrain here. This is going to be right at the brainstem, which connects down to our spinal cord. So, the hindbrain is going to be filled with a couple different components here. The hindbrain is the oldest portion. All of our ancestors, right, lizards, kind of any major creature is going to have these in their brain. Some of them will also have a lot of our midbrain components too, but let's talk about the hindbrain, this most ancient and basic structure of the brain. There's three portions we can that we're focused on here, and that's the medulla. And yes, this is the medulla oblongata. There is the pons here, and it's not colored in this one, but there is the cerebellum, this portion of the brain that looks a little different than the rest, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. But so the spinal cord is going to be down here, which sends out and receives a bunch of information. And these are going to be our first checkpoints for information being sent to our brain from the body. And the medulla, to start off, is going to be focused on our vital functions. So keeping our blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing all regulated. The things that we need to do to stay alive. So of course, some of the earliest things the brain did was just help us stay alive and regulate. Additionally, this is part of the reason you might feel lightheaded if you stand up, right? You are changing your position and it's messing with your blood pressure. So that is the medulla. We also have the pons. The pons is kind of the relay between the upper and lower parts, and this is part of where you would see the crossover of motor nerves. So this is where motor nerves kind of start being sent down. You'll also note that this is where sleep and dreaming come into play, so a very, again, ancient part of the brain. And finally, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum over here is related to how you move, so that's why it's so much bigger in dolphins than it is in humans. But you can think about a young child who hasn't learned how to write their letters well yet. Their cerebellum is still developing. Individuals who are drunk, right? If you drink a lot of alcohol, that affects your cerebellum. That sends inhibitory signals. It says, don't fire signals. It makes you less balanced, more off balance. Similarly, it might be affected by a stroke. So you can note that when we talk about the hindbrain, this ancient part of the brain, what is it doing? Not much more than keeping us alive. It's kind of just the automatic functions in the back of the brain. When we move on to the midbrain, I don't have much to talk about with the midbrain. The midbrain also makes up the kind of top of the brainstem. The midbrain and the hindbrain, other than the cerebellum, make up what we would consider our brainstem here. Now, the midbrain, the major thing that the midbrain is doing is it is going to be processing visual and auditory signals. So our eyes are going to be receiving or taking information, sending it up here. Our ears, which are going to be, placed right here, are going to be sending information right here and to help you integrate what you see and what you hear together. It also helps you to integrate your movements, right? To send out movements. This is why you're able to have somebody call out your name and say, catch this, and you're able to look and hopefully catch it and not fumble. But that is the idea of the midbrain. So what is the midbrain's most use? It's going to be connecting things together, making sense of what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and putting those together so we can deal with that information. Lastly, and most importantly, we have the forebrain. And the forebrain is made up of two major components: the limbic system in green here, and that cerebral cortex, that cerebellum, that outer portion of our brain, the wrinkly portion, as you will. So I want to go ahead and show you here all of the different parts of the limbic system. So you can imagine with this top picture, we are looking kind of this way towards me, right? If this was my brain, you can see the cerebellum back here, this big piece here, the spinal cord down here with your pons, etc. And you'll notice that the limbic system is going to be a part of this sensory and integration with this movement control. I like to think about limbic is going to help you with your limbs. It's going to help you move. It's also going to be related to the memory and emotion circuits. You'll notice that we have this thing called an amygdala here, this little guy up here. Amygdala is Greek for the word almond. So it's shaped like an almond, and the amygdala is related to emotion, specifically anger. So I like to think about the amygdala and anger as related. So this helps us to associate features, right, of something and how we feel about it. And so you can imagine that if we see something scary, our amygdala is going to fire. Note that your amygdala is right next to this thing called a hippocampus. A hippocampus means seahorse in Greek because you'll notice this wraps around this portion like a seahorse. The hippocampus is actually the memory center of the brain. This helps us to form and make memories and to retrieve memories. So our hippocampus is going to be very important for us. It's close to the amygdala. So you'll note that why maybe traumatic memories are remembered differently, slightly differently than other memories, is because of that relation to the amygdala here. Finally, we've got the thalamus. So the thalamus is going to be that relay station. It's going to help put those signals together, make sense of them, and be able to send that information back down. Underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Hypo, underneath. And so the hypothalamus, what that is actually going to do is be related to drives and motivations. So that is going to help control our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and our hormones. Now, when it comes to the hippocampus, I always like to think that right, you would never forget a hippo if you saw it on campus, which is a great way to remember hippocampus. I'll continue on. So moving on, we can talk about the cerebral cortex, the outer surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And so in the outer surface, we can see that there are 4 different lobes or areas of the brain. We have the temporal lobe here at the bottom. We have the parietal lobe at the top. We have the frontal lobe at the front and the occipital lobe at the back. Now, what do each of these areas do? Well, the frontal lobe is going to be the most recently developed portion of the brain. So this is going to be focused on things like higher order thinking, your ability to imagine, well, what kind of college do I want to go to? You have the temporal lobe. So this is near the temples, is one way I like to think about that. It's related to hearing, memory, emotion, and some language. The occipital lobe in the back of the brain is related to your ability to see. Interestingly enough, the eyes send signals all the way to the back of the brain to help you see. And then finally, we have the parietal lobe, which is going to be having the somatosensory cortex, or how our body actually feels. So the functional areas of the brain, not just the right kind of anatomical north, south, east, west, include sections right here at the top, which are related to this sensory cortex, which we see here. So you'll note that certain portions of the brain are going to be correlated with different feelings and different senses. So right here on the brain, you can see there are auditory cortexes. So this is where audio, sound is processed in your brain. The back of the brain is the visual cortex and the occipital lobe, where we are going to have visual information be dealt with. And then we have this somatosensory cortex here. So this is in the parietal lobe, as we mentioned. And somatosensory, this is related to how your body feels. So this is where touch, pain, temperature, this is where all of that information is processed in your brain. Another area of your brain is the association cortex. And I want to talk specifically about these as I find them very interesting. So there are certain areas in your brain that are related to associations with language. And if you have difficulty in either of these areas, Broca's or Wernicke's, you are going to have difficulty speaking. And so if you notice, the Broca's area is related to having issues with, some of your auditory cortex, and similar with the Wernicke's being related to the secondary auditory cortex. And if we have issues with these areas of the brain, we might have what is called an aphasia, or a difficulty in producing something. So in this case, we are talking about auditory aphasias or oral aphasias. And so one type of aphasia, Broca's area, is that it's very difficult to speak. You maybe can't even speak, or it's not grammatical. So you might, somebody might ask you about how you're doing, and you might say, scary refrigerator flowers, books. And they look at you and go, I have no idea what you mean. Right? So this would be an issue with being able to process and understand language. Wernicke's, on the other hand, Wernicke's aphasia is the ability to speak, but it's garbled and without meaning. So this person would look at you and be like, desert sun, happy fun time greatness. And you would be like, excuse me? And they would think that they're making sense to you. So they might say, Royal Obs, try maybe fun go. And you're like, I'm having trouble with this. And so there's a couple videos I've posted where you can see whether or not these are Wernicke's or Broca's to give you an idea. If you are interested, you can see those on the PowerPoints. But one of the last things I'd like to talk about is this idea of left and right brained. Well, is it the case that we are left or right brained? Kinda, but not really. How I like to think about it is that our left and right brains are better for different portions of thinking, but if something were to happen to you, you would be able to probably get by even if there was an issue. So we all use what is known as lateralization. We all use both sides of our brain, but certain sides are better than other things. And this is the idea here that our left side of our brain controls our right side of our body, and our right side of our brain controls the left side of our body. Not only that, but the left hemisphere is going to be focused on language, and it's going to be receiving that info for the right side, whereas the right hemisphere is focused on this nonverbal information, so more imagery, more emotion, more perception. However, language, nonverbal actions, and how we sense and how we perceive things are going to be focused on both of these sides of the brain. Now, the book brings up this idea of what happens, though, if you cut that connection between sides of the brain, if you cut the corpus callosum, or big body, colossal body, what that means. And what happens is the brain actually is getting mixed information. So in one really interesting study, what you do is you take participants who have had their corpus callosum cut, usually because of issues with seizures or something, and you have them look at some kind of contraption where they can only see half of something at a time. And when they are looking at something using their right side of their brain, the verbal side, or the right side of their brain, they can see the object, but they can't use the verbal, If they are looking at something on the left side, that's being controlled by the right part of their brain. The right part of their brain is the nonverbal part, the one that's more focused on pictures. So what happens when you show that? They say, I didn't see anything. On the other hand, if you then ask them, you say, okay, I know you said you didn't see anything, but go ahead and reach in there and pick up whatever you saw. And they say, I didn't see anything. Well, just try. And then they will pick up the right object. On the other hand, if you ask them to look with their left brain, the right side of their body, they are going to be able to say, I saw this. They're going to use that verbal part. So you can see how that works here as well. It's very important to note that our brains, though, are very plastic. They're able to change, that we are able to um, suffer issues in our brains, especially if we're young, and be able to grow and change. This video, I'm not going to show it, but you can watch it on the slides, asks you the question of how much of your brain do you think you can live without? And this girl in this video lives without half of her brain. She has half of a brain and she lives a mostly normal life. And so, how is that possible? Well, we use neuroplasticity. Our brain is able to adapt. So, that is everything we're going to cover for this lecture. I hope you all feel comfortable with this lot of information here, but as always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Hope you all have a great day and enjoy.